now of each other. It's lovely to see y'all, particularly the folks who I got to have in my small group last week. I hope that you're beginning to feel some connectedness to your cohort. I was particularly delighted to see your interactions in the fora, the discussion forums. I think that seems to be going really well. And we'll have a chance at the end to do a little debriefing on that, on our accommodating folks' concerns about having too many readings. And Hugo will again introduce us at the end of the meeting to what we're going to be doing over the next week. But for now, I have the pleasure of introducing you to the module for this week and to our guest speaker, Dr. George Lundberg, who I will introduce in a moment. And for the time being, though, I want to do a little introduction of our discussion this week. And here are our slides, and let me just walk you through a little bit of an introduction to our second session with just all of us learners and tutors. So this week's emphasis, as you know, is on ethics. And I think this is a particularly important piece for public health leadership because everything we do, I think, has a foundation of ethics rather than commerce or beauty or some other foundational principle. I think that our ethical obligation to each other is particularly emphatically manifested in public health ethics. So I'm going to give you a little introduction to some of our learning objectives around this and some of the concepts. And then Dr. Lundberg is going to give us a talk for a few minutes and then guide some collective discussions. And then we'll close at the end, probably a couple minutes till 5. We'll stop and Hugo will lead us in our discussions about next week. So let me leap in to our learning objectives for this particular class. There are 3 learning objectives for today's session. We're going to be diving in a little more deeply into the fundamental concepts for ethics of transparency, integrity, and honesty, which we'll discuss the definitions of in a moment. Dr. Lundberg is going to explore various aspects in health and public health about the relationship between leadership and ethics, and in particular, this notion of how, as I just mentioned, how are public health and ethics integrally tied through the shared notion of human rights. So definitions to start with of transparency. And I want to ask you, you can see at the bottom, to maybe put into the chat, if you would, some thoughts about what in this definition, which is a generic, not public health oriented one, what's missing for our context for a general discussion of transparency. And I'll give you my notion to get you started. There are 3 such questions that I'd like you to respond to in the chat. My notion here is that this is really mercantile and commercial. And in public health, we have higher aspirations for transparency all the way to establishing policy. That's a process that often involves communities. So if you could put in some of your thoughts about what's missing in this definition of transparency. And likewise, in this definition of integrity. I found it harder to come up with pieces that were missing. So I'll be interested to see what you all have to think about that. And you can continue this exercise as we go forward. pasting that into the chat. So transparency, integrity, and also in this one, this last definition about honesty. And to me, again, this seemed adequate but generic, and not to go to the depth that I think public health demands of radical honesty. And I'm just putting that concept out there for now, for this week. Miriam Chickering will be discussing that next week when she talks about leadership and systems. What's the role of radical honesty in systems, especially in highly bureaucratic systems like the ones that many of you are in? So today, again, we're talking about this conjoint notion of leadership and ethics. And these all rest on fundamental principles of social justice, of equality, and the foundation of that is fairness, implying fairness by all the demographic characteristics that we usually stratify on, and to all the outcomes, the basic outcomes that we usually look at as well. With the notion, of course, that one can't always get to fairness, but we do try to get at minimum to equity, to removing barriers that get in the way of fairness. And then rights themselves, again, most fundamentally, can be divided into those that we've encoded in law and those that we've embedded in our moral codes. And I think that for a lot of you, again, working in public health bureaucracies, that many of you, from my experience of working at, for example, the US CDC, that many of us come to public health because we are driven by a deep investment in moral rights, in equity and fairness. But we have to function in their manifestation in legal rights. And that, of course, sets up tensions, particularly, say, in situations like many people are facing now, including at the CDC, of there being a tension between what really is, in their mind, more morally justifiable and what their chain of command is dictating be done. So that means when that's available, that there's opportunities to have these kinds of discussions without having to have leaks of them. So for example, when Bill Foege, a shared colleague of George Lundberg and I, when his letter, he was one of the most inspiring directors of CDC ever. I imagine you might agree, George. And when his letter to the current director of CDC was leaked a few weeks ago, it made me glad that his wisdom was shared, but it made me sad that there wasn't a procedure where that kind of sage wisdom could be heard in a more appropriate and straightforward way. So these are the foundational principles that underlie social justice: the equal right to equal basic rights and liberties, with inequalities satisfying two conditions that for them to be excused. And now we're going to transition to Dr. Lundberg's talk to embed these in his decades of experience as the editor of JAMA and the other extraordinary innovations in health sciences education that he has led, both from an ethics perspective and from an implementation research perspective. So these are follow-up pieces that we will put into, these slides, of course, will be available to you. These may be useful for you to look at for follow-up. And I'm going to stop sharing my slides in a moment and um, ask Dr. Lundberg to lead us through his introduction to these concepts and then to guide us through discussing these questions. George, you ready to take it away? Yeah?
I am ready. Why don't we let me see everybody out there. I don't need that screen with those PowerPoints, and I don't intend to use any PowerPoints. It's well,
Okay.
those are comprehensive, powerful PowerPoints, Erica. If everybody out there remembers everything on those slides, that'll be just great. But there we are. I'm looking at you, and you're looking at me, and I presume you can hear me. My sound seems to be working all right. And you've had some experience with each other, so with luck, we'll actually be able to get some discussion, even though I kind of like to be there with Monique because I like her backdrop better than anybody else. Is that a real backdrop, Monique, or is that just one of these Zoom backdrops? No, okay. Monique says she shakes her head and said that real backdrop. I
It's
believe
a
it.
good afternoon, everyone. It's a real background. I actually took that picture myself on the Berry Islands, one of the islands here in the Bahamas.
Well, that's great. My background's a real background also. Over to the right of my shoulder, there is a well, there's a window. I drew the shade down because I didn't want the light from the outside. I'm in California, and so here it's just a little about 10 after 1. And so I've got an actual plant there off my left shoulder, and then I've got an Oxford English Dictionary, small print version is that book you see back there. And we have right next to it a magnifying glass, which you have to use. That used to be a really important thing back before the internet, but now you can get the whole OED on the internet anyway. That's there sort of to give an academic feel to what we're going to be talking about. Uh, I'm going to talk, as Erica said earlier on in our conversation before this session began, she asked how much I'm going to talk at you. Well, I'm talking at you now, maybe, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes, something like that. And then I hope I can talk with you and we can talk with each other in whatever way it goes. I'll guide that with a lot of questions. I'll pose a lot of things. I don't expect you to remember much from this lecture, frankly. If you can think back 10 years ago to a lecture, remember one and what did you learn in that particular lecture? You know, that's pretty hard. But what I do expect you to remember is that we had this session. It did happen. We were there. You were part of it. It was about ethics, and it seemed to matter. That's the first thing I want you to remember from this lecture, and I do expect you to remember that. The second thing I expect you to remember from this lecture is a placard that's on the front, right up from the stairs in Tallahassee, Florida, at Florida State University at the library, where there's a placard when you walk in it says that half of knowledge is knowing where to find knowledge. And I would say it's a whole lot more than half. But knowing where to go to quickly find something. And I'm hopeful that I will be presenting you with places that I have curated for 40 or 50 years and that are the places to go as opposed to anything else you might find, which obviously you could at any time. So that's what I'm hoping we can do. Well, who am I? Very briefly, I started working in healthcare in 1951. That's not a typo, 1951, where I got a job in the summer at a hospital owned by the city of Mobile, Alabama on the Gulf Coast and run by the Sisters of Charity, the nuns out of an order in New Orleans. And my first job was janitor, mopping the floors in the operating room. And I was really good at that. There was a lot of blood on the floor, and I had good mops, and I mopped them. So after about 2 weeks of that, the sister came to me and said, "You're doing a really good job. We'd like to promote you." Oh, well, what do you want me to be? Well, we want you to be an orderly. Okay, well, what do orderlies do? Well, they do anything the nurse tells them to, but you go up there, and back then, Mobile, Alabama was 100% segregated. Black male ward, white male ward, all of that. That was law in that part of the country, and I grew up with that. So that summer and all the next summer, I was an orderly there. And one of the orderlies I worked with was in the seminary in the Vatican. He was a brilliant guy. He ended up as Archbishop for that part of the United States in the Catholic Church. His name was Oliver Lipscomb, and that's for real. A good friend, a terrific guy. So after that, then I split my career into basically four parts, pretty much equal, not by choice. Most of my life has been by chance, but chance comes around and you grab it and you try to take advantage of what you can. And that's the way it's worked out. But basically, that gives me this kind of a experiential understanding about the ethics of all this kind of stuff where I've been working all this life. About the first 15 years of my career was spent in public service as a government employee in the United States Army for 11 years, the Vietnam War, medical officer, all that kind of stuff. Then the County of Los Angeles, another charity hospital, the LA County Hospital, where I ran the labs for a long time. That's the first quarter of my career. The second quarter of my career was entirely in full-time academia, mostly on the West Coast, University of Southern California, and then the University of California, Davis, where I became a full professor and chairman of the Department of Pathology. My field is pathology. Now, you know a little bit about pathology. Some of you may know a lot about pathology. Pathology is basically laboratory based, but even though I basically am an academic pathologist by background with a lot of years in doing that kind of thing, including forensic, coroner type work, all that kind of stuff. Nonetheless, my principal interest has always been how people behave. Why do they behave the way they behave? So human behavior is at the basis of ethics, at the basis of health, your own health, the health of everybody else, the basis of education, self-education, maintenance of education. It's all there in terms of how you behave. So that led me, well, into my third quarter of my career, which was in not-for-profit medical publishing. As Erica mentioned, I was the editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association for 17 years, ran all of the AMA scientific publications there, started their website, had a television show weekly and all that stuff. We did a lot of things with medical students, and that's how Erica came to town as a medical student, wanting to learn something about medical journals and how they worked. And she came and she learned, and she ran a section of our Journal of the American Medical Association that was by students for students, and did an outstanding job with that. And so we've had a relationship of that kind ever since. Thank you very much, Erica. I've worked well for you and for a few other people like Scott Gottlieb, who used to ran the US FDA. He was there shortly after Erica, or maybe it was before Erica. I'm not really sure. Thereabouts. And then after those 17 years running JAMA and learning all this stuff about medical journals, then I went off to have the last quarter of my career in for-profit entrepreneurialism, startups. We started this, we started that, we started the other. Some of them actually worked and worked very well. If you do any of you use Medscape, Medscape? Erica does. The rest of you, some heads. Remember this today. Don't let the sun set tonight without becoming a member of Medscape. www.medscape.com. It's free, but you have to register. I ran it for 10 years, and I've been working at it part-time now. After those 10, we're up to 17 or 18 years there. An outstanding source of clean, up-to-date information on all kinds of medicine and public health. There's a whole public health tract on Medscape. We welcome physicians, other healthcare professionals of all kinds, but you have to register, and then it's free. and we won't
We're
rip
going
you
to
off.
be using the recent article about CDC and its demise in the next few weeks as we have a discussion about that. So yes,
Yeah. And
they'll
while
get
we're
into
at
Medscape
Medscape,
there.
I didn't invent Medscape. It was already 5 years old when I went there, but I ran it for 10 years basically and made it into the power that it is at the moment, which is really, really proud of that. Then after I left there, I went with a competitor called MedPage Today. Do any of you use that? Okay, we'll write that one down. MedPage Today, MEDPAGE This is a news-based source, but as a competitor of Medscape does news reporting even better than Medscape does. They both do free CME and continuing education for nurses, pharmacists, and others as well. You don't have to register to be a member or to use MedPage Today. They encourage you to, but you don't have to. But it's another clean. I worked there for 3 years actually, as we were in competition with Medscape after I left there. So that brings us to now. But for you all, a peak learning experience of my life about ethics and health and public health was in 1966 when I had 3 months on a fellowship in tropical medicine in every country in Central America except Nicaragua, plus Mexico, south of Mexico. I learned so much about tropical diseases, about how government affects public health, about how given children who are walking to school and getting hookworm shoes so they wouldn't get hookworm as a principal intervention method, and then learning that they wouldn't wear the shoes to school because why? They would get muddy. They would carry the shoes to school, wash off their feet, and put the nice clean shoes on. Then when it got time to go home, they take off these clean, pretty shoes and walk through hookworm infested fields to go to their house. Really? Oh my God. Human behavior. In Caparina, does that still exist? Okay. This is a PAHO activity way back then to try to get protein into kids who were suffering from kwashiorkor because they didn't get enough protein in their diet. I mean, in Central America, southern Mexico, when the child baby comes off the breast, there's a gap time until the child can get into uh, beans and tortillas and get enough beans and tortillas to get enough protein to not have protein deficiency. And we saw many kids in hospitals in Central America back then with kwashiorkor because they didn't make that bridge from the breast to the beans soon enough. And so PAHO had this thing called Encaparino, which was an effort to take the Coca-Cola that everybody was drinking, really full of sugar, of course, and replace it with a protein drink. And they tried marketing it like crazy to prevent kwashiorkor. Again, lessons in public health in the 1960s. Never forgot them. If you really learn something, it's always there to help you. Okay, I'm not going to ask you to tell me what you did, but I'd like you to think about why did you behave the way you behaved last night? Well, I'm looking at your faces. You're either stone-faced, you don't want me to know how you behaved last night, or you'd rather not remember it, or maybe you don't remember it. I don't know. But the way you behaved last night was controlled by something. And what on earth was that? Well, human behavior. Why do we behave the way we behave? Well, first, our genes. You're born with them, and they control an awful lot of you. How big you get, how tall you get, not how fat you get, maybe, but certainly how big, how tall you get, how fast you can run, to some extent, how smart you are, how capable you are of learning, all kinds of stuff in your genes. And you can't do anything about your genes except now there's this whole science of epigenetics, which you can do a lot about. And we're learning so much about that. It's an amazing thing, epigenetics. Well, what else besides genes? Well, you behaved the way you behaved last night because the way your mother raised you. If it wasn't your mother, it was your father or another caregiver, some family member probably, or a surrogate family member. And whether you were praised for some behavior, punished for some behavior, whether there was a lot of modeling going on, how your toilet training went, and on and on and on. And this has a lot to do with how you behaved last night. Well, what else? Who are your friends? What are your peers? Who were your peers when you were in third grade? Maybe sixth grade, maybe eighth grade? Last night, were you wearing a mask? Were your peers wearing a mask? Or were you in a group that said, I don't wear a mask. I'm a big, tough guy. I'm going to be fine. I don't care if I get the virus. Oh, yeah, well, maybe grandma will die from it, but she's kind of old anyway. I mean, really. Peer pressure. And in this country, my country, the United States, oh, what a mess we have with peer pressure. Well, beyond that, what? Well, there's a hierarchy that determines what you do in addition to those three elements. One of the slides that Erica had up that I suggested included the hierarchy, which includes personal morality, societal ethics, and public law. Now, personal morality may be defined as a quality or fact of conforming to or deriving from right ideas of human conduct, goodness and uprightness of behavior. And if your personal morality, plus those other controllers I already talked about, is strong enough, there's no need for ethics. There's certainly no need for public law. But if it isn't, and if it isn't for the balance of your community, then we have a thing called ethics. And what is ethics in this hierarchy? A little lower plane, lower bar than personal morality, which is the most important after your mother and your genes. Ethics are principles of conduct governing an individual or profession, the ideals of character manifested by a people. And if your personal morality and your societal ethics are ubiquitous, strong, and really controlling, that's enough. You don't need laws. The very existence of a law defines failure of the other controllers, because if they hadn't failed, you wouldn't need the law. Alas, for many, they do fail. So we have law, public law. And what is that? Well, law is a rule or mode of conduct or action that is formally recognized as binding by a supreme controlling authority, is made obligatory by a sanction, punishment if you don't obey it. That's the law. And those are the elements that determined how you behaved last night and how you will behave tonight and maybe tomorrow. I would like a show of hands at this time, partly to see whether you're awake and whether you're listening and responsive. How many of you consider yourself professionals? Raise your hand. 3, 4. You're looking at other people, seeing whether your hand goes up, and there's a few screens blocked out, and you're professional. Okay, well, let's explore what that is. Okay, the definitions of professionalism, which I add learned professionalism, that I like to use were established by a woman named Dr. Chris Castle, an internist professor currently active with the Kaiser School of Health or School of Medicine in Pasadena, California, one of our newest medical schools. At one time, she was the president of the American Board of Internal Medicine and a lot of other stuff. And she wrote something for me in JAMA that I published, that I asked her to write, that I published in an editorial I don't know, 20, 25 years ago, something like that, about what are the features of a learned professional. There are 10. If anybody wants to take notes, I wouldn't mind that at all, because these are things that you could find that in JAMA if you would. Chris Castle, Cassell, professional, and put it in Google with JAMA in the 90s, you could probably find this. But meanwhile, here are the 10. Self-governance. Well, that's what I said already, you know. You don't need law. You don't even need ethics. Self-governance. Do the right thing yourself, no matter what else is going on. That's number one. Number two, in her list, in our country, this certainly applies in the healthcare field, many other parts of the world, not all of them, but many. Service to the poor without the expectation of compensation. Giving without expecting payment. Not always. You have to have income or else you can't feed your face, but nonetheless, delivering quality because that's what professionals do, not ripping people off. High level of learning, a learned professional. Traditionally, there are only 4 categories of people called learned professionals. Nowadays, there are many more, but traditionally, they were physicians, lawyers, the clergy or priesthood or rabbis or what have you, and to some extent, teachers. Those are the original 4 categories of learned professionals. Now, everybody likes to speak of themselves as professionals, and that's fine as long as they satisfy the criteria, or at least most of them. The next 5 criteria, features of a learned professional, are autonomy of activity. You can operate by yourself and do just fine. You don't need anybody telling you what to do. Autonomy. Altruism, doing the right thing. Self-sacrifice as needed. In our country and most countries in the world now, as a matter of fact, and that self-sacrifice leads into heroism as needed. The heroism of those of us working actively in medicine during the COVID epidemic in 2020 has been spectacular. It's given me faith again in the medical profession in our country, where I had lost a lot of my faith in it. And the heroism that's been demonstrated, up to and including loss of your own life because you present yourself to intubate somebody who's coughing COVID in your face. They have to have it. I mean, really, wow. I'm impressed. And number 10, ethical practice with public accountability. You don't need the public to tell you what to do because you're doing it, but you are accountable to the public, and you're happy to have that accountability acted out. My favorite medical ethicist was a Roman Catholic doctor who had a variety of roles as a family doctor in Kentucky for a long time. He was president of University of Kentucky for a while. Then he went off to Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. to head up a center of ethics, and his name was Ed Pellegrino. Ed is dead now, but Ed did a lot of writing about ethics, among the best, and we were privileged to have Ed on our JAMA editorial board for 10, 12 years, something like that. And this is my best quote from him. Quote, "One of the defining features of a professional is the voluntary self-imposition of higher than ordinary standards. Hold yourself to a standard higher than the ordinary person, even in your field. And when faced with a difficult decision, the true professional will face his or her own self-interest and do what's right for others. That's the essence. You can find that quote also in JAMA in editorials that I have written. Okay. Now let's talk about medical ethics and public health ethics. In many ways, they're the same. In many ways, they are different because medicine basically is a profession that deals with individual health. It ought to deal with population health as well, and sometimes it does, but often it doesn't seem to. But one patient, one doctor, one decision at one moment. That's the essence of clinical medicine. Public health, on the other hand, is population health. What does this do to the health of a large group, a small group, a given geographic area, what have you? So their ethics overlap. And an editorial I had in my at-large column in Medscape earlier this year asked the question whether COVID experience might blend or even merge the professions of medicine and public health in the United States, where they have never been blended. Blended occasionally, merged never, generally exist in separate schools and often have separate faculties that don't even talk to each other in many instances and don't share classes. And I'm asking the Medscape readership whether maybe now physicians have learned enough and public health people have learned enough that they see the enormous value of each other and might be able to work better together. But who wants to tell me something about anything fundamental about medical ethics or public health ethics? Like, where would you go to find out? Or do you already know a lot about it? Seema Persad, do you know? Where would you go to look up medical ethics or public health ethics? She heard me. I can see it in her face. What do you think?
Possibly the code of conduct for the profession. That's it.
Where would you go look for details to learn more about it in addition to Erica Frank's opening set of PowerPoints? Candace, what do you think? Turn off your mute button. I want to hear your voice.
Sorry, you just introduced us to Medscape, so I would try there.
That's not a bow. That's I like this woman. She's a fast learner.
Yeah, but also talking to professionals, I think ethics can become, it's such a dynamic thing. I think when you're first learning about it, it seems very black and white. And then it starts to get gray. And for me, I like to speak to persons who have had experience and they can advise me on how they made the decision and what were the factors they considered.
Monique, where would you go to look for basics of medical ethics?
I would probably go Medscape as well, but I would also do probably like the American Public Health Association or something like some organization that deals with public health foundationally. And then I know there's a book, Public Health Law. So
now remember, law and ethics are related, but law is
not
law.
the same.
And we don't need law if we've got enough good ethics. So there are people mix them up all the time. Matter of fact, when I went to work at the American Medical Association, there was a volunteer council called the Council on Judicial Affairs. But during my time there, it was changed to the Council on Ethical and Judicial Affairs, and the ethics part took over for most of it, but they did try to play both of them together. Now, all of you are looking at your Zoom, but some of you probably have a handheld with you that you can go to. And if you do, if you go to Google, which is obviously the right answer for almost anything, is all you do is punch into Google AMA Principles of Medical Ethics. So if you don't do that now, you could do it at another time, but that's what I'm going to be looking at now, because in 1846, the American Medical Association was founded. There were a lot of reasons for that, but one of the main one was to create a code of medical ethics. None existed. And AMA was invented as a member organization of physicians only in 1846, when being a physician didn't mean much, but it did mean you took care of sick people and you did the best you could with them, but you didn't have necessarily have much training to do that. But so a code of medical ethics early was a project of the American Medical Association, and it has been one ever since. So the book on medical ethics from the AMA is hundreds of pages long, and it's always having a new opinion here, a new opinion there on almost anything you could possibly name, and that's freely available on the internet as a code. But I'm going to focus on the principles, which haven't changed since 2001. These 9 principles of medical ethics that you're going to find when you look them up are 9 in number, and were first published in 1957, having been adopted by the AMA. And then they were revised in 1980, revised in 2001. And I checked them today against the 2001 version, hadn't changed a word in that period of time. And if you study these, you'll know more about it than most American doctors do, because I have often given lectures on ethics to American physicians. I say, well, how many of you know about the principles of medical ethics of the AMA? And they get silence. I say, well, how many are they? Nobody knows. I say, well, look, I was running a medical school. In the first year of medical school, I would say, you have to memorize these suckers because they govern how you behave the rest of your professional life. And even though you may not know about them, if you're an AMA member, you are charged with doing them no matter what. And the laws that govern physicians in the United States, yes, they are laws because ethics wasn't good enough. That's why they are. But they're all based on the medical ethics of the AMA. Okay, here they are. Number 1. A physician shall be dedicated to providing competent medical care. Good, competent. That's pretty good right there. You better be competent and you better exercise your competence. That's number 1. If you're not competent, don't do it. With compassion. Yeah. And respect for human dignity and human rights. That's number 1. That's pretty powerful. If that's all you have, that's not bad for a starter. Number 2, a physician shall uphold the standards of professionalism. There's that word again, professionalism. Be honest in all professional interaction. Now here's a biggie, strive to report physicians, your colleagues, deficient in character or competence, or engaging in fraud or deception to appropriate entities, to be the bad guy, to turn somebody in. He might be your partner. Yeah, that's an ethical responsibility. Is that hard? It is sometimes. But nobody ever said good ethics was easy. Let me put the mute on. That's a cough from allergy from my long walk today, and also talking. It is not COVID. It's been around much longer than COVID has. Number 3, a physician shall respect the rights of patients, colleagues, other health professionals, and shall safeguard patient confidences and privacy within the constraints of the law. And here law can supersede because privacy might have to be breached. If, for example, a patient tells the doctor, I'm going to go home and kill my wife. That's a no-no. You can break privacy in that situation. Number 4, a physician shall here we go. Number 5, a physician shall this is important, shall continue to study, apply and advance scientific knowledge, science, okay, Maintain a commitment to medical education, always committed to medical education. That includes self-education and education of others. Make relevant information available to patients, colleagues, and the public. Obtain consultation and use the talents of other health professionals when indicated. You mean like acupuncturists? Well, is that a health professional? It is in my view, it is. A massage therapist, is that a health professional? Well, there are massage therapists and then there are massage therapists. And I would say, yes, that is indeed a profession. On the other hand, the world's oldest profession might be hooked up there on occasion. Now, but anyway, chiropractors and other such folks, yeah, it's ethically appropriate to utilize the talents of other health care professionals. Absolutely. Number 6, a physician shall, in the provision of appropriate patient care, except in emergencies, be free to choose whom to serve. Now, this was an arguing point for many, many years. Doctors say, well, that means I can't not serve a patient. If somebody wants to be my patient, I don't want them as a patient. Can I not have a patient? The answer is yes, you can choose not to have them as a patient, but not in an emergency. You don't have a choice in an emergency situation. And you have to find another doctor for them if they're your doctor in order to get rid of them as a patient, but then you can. Choose whom to serve, with whom to associate, and the environment in which to provide medical care. The environment's really important here also. Number 7, a physician shall recognize a responsibility to participate in activities contributing to the improvement of the community and the betterment of public health. It's your job as a doctor to contribute to the betterment of public health. So they are the same. They are together inculcated into these basic principles. Number 8, a physician shall, while caring for a patient, regard responsibility to the patient, to that patient, as paramount. The doctor has no responsibility to the employer of the doctor or the owner of the company that employs the doctor. None, when dealing directly with that patient. And if you're interested in writing something down, I'm going to refer you to another one-page read in JAMA. Write it down. And the Patient-Physician Covenant, Covenant. 8 people wrote that. I published it 15, 20 years ago. Ed Pellegrino was one of the authors. I was one of the authors. There are 6 other people. Chris Castle, who I referred to earlier, was one of the authors. So read that one pager having to do with the corporate practice of medicine or doctors working for employers who are a problem in that area, okay? And number 9, a physician shall support access to medical care for all people. That comes pretty close to calling it a right, not a privilege, to have access to medical care. Now, I went, in preparation for today, I went to the American Public Health Association. Georges Benjamin is the director there. I've known Georges for 20, 25 years. We've been on programs together. Terrific guy, do a great job, especially now. And I went there and I looked up the Code of Ethics for the Public Health Association, and I found it. I recommend you go there. On the other hand, it's 34 pages. And they're good 34 pages. You can outline them. There are elements to them of various kinds, but go read them. They're in no way incompatible with what I just read to you. They emphasize different things, but they're completely compatible. And there we are. Okay. If you've published a paper in a journal or a magazine or a newspaper or something like that yourself, would you raise up your hand? If you published a paper. A few hands are going up. If you plan to publish a paper or would like to publish a paper, raise up your hand. A few more people have this for as an incentive, so that's fine. You don't have to publish. Publish is just one of the ways that you get information to other people. But it's an important way. I've been working as a medical editor full-time since 1982, so I feel rather strongly about the field. I've lived with it a long time. And just like the basics of the medical professional ethics, and I've given you the top 9 and the way to get them for 30 pages of public health ethics, I'm now going to tell you how, if you want to write a paper for a medical journal, where you start. Well, you start with Mr. Google, of course, and you do www.icmje.org. ICMJE. That is an abbreviation. That is not an acronym. You know the difference? Who knows the difference between, not you, Erica, but who knows the difference between an abbreviation and an acronym? Sonia, do you know the difference between an acronym and an abbreviation? Anybody? Colin does. What's the difference? Well, I thought he did,
An
but
acronym is the letters spelled for the words for the whatever you're calling out, and an abbreviation is just an abbreviation of a word necessarily.
Yeah.
So an acronym are the actual letters of each word in the
yes, and a very simple distinction is an abbreviation is an abbreviation. It stands on its own. An acronym can be pronounced. So JAMA is an acronym, JAMA. New England Journal of Medicine is called NEJM. It is not an acronym. Try to pronounce NEJM, where you could try it. Kind of tongue-tying. I'm getting feedback that usually means that somebody's got their cell phone on as a way to connect, but not always. Anyway, so an acronym you could pronounce. For example, there's an organization called the World Association of Medical Editors, also known as acronym WAME, easy, W-A-M-E, WAME. WAME is an egalitarian organization with hundreds of medical editors, almost 1,000, almost 2,000 actually, who joined it after we created it about 1996 to help produce medical information on the internet. WAME, egalitarian. The International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, on the other hand, is in no way egalitarian. It is elite, self-appointed, self-anointed since 1978, when New England Journal of Medicine, JAMA, the AMA Library, the BMJ, and the Annals of Internal Medicine got together in Vancouver, Canada, to create the beginning of a group to write the rules of how medical journals should function. They were called the Vancouver Group because they were founded in Vancouver. Makes sense. They're not from Vancouver. There's nobody in the group ever been from Vancouver, and they've never had a meeting there. But nonetheless, the Vancouver Group is ICMJE, and it writes the rules. Now, for 42 years, been writing the rules on how medical journals work, how medical publishers work, how medical reporters work, how medical ethicists work in relation to medical publishing, how advertisers work, how sponsorship works, how conflict of interest works and doesn't work, how you try to prevent it, on and on and on. So if you want to know any of those things, you go to www.icmje.org. They're updated once a year. When I used to, I sat with the group for 17 years and helped participate in writing a lot of this stuff. But things change. It's been expanded a lot. We used to call it the uniform requirements for manuscripts submitted to biomedical journals. And there were sections like, what is an author anyway? What is a contributor? What is an editor? What does an editor do? What is peer review? What are conflicts of interest? How about privacy and confidentiality, protection of human subject, and so forth and so forth. It's an ethics manual for how to write for publication that every journal editor has to follow, every author writing for publication in a primary source journal should follow, because the editors are. You might as well know what the editor's rule book is. And that's the way that happens. So ICMJ, now they call it guidelines as opposed to requirements. These days, people don't like to be told, well, these are requirements, even though they are. So they're guidelines at this point, and you can read those. They used to be simple. They are no longer simple. They're complicated, which leads me to the last topic. I have 5 minutes to 2 on my calendar here, on my clock. And before I get into it, which has to do with how did we create the medical internet and how about the ethics of the medical internet, I'm going to lead you to the 2 places to read about that. And then I'm going to shut up and let anybody who wants to raise their hand ask a question, disagree with what I said, or extend the conversation. These are the 2 references for you. The first is in JAMA, April 16, 1997, page 1244 in volume 277. It's a long article, 2 pages, but that's all you need. It's called Assessing, Controlling, and Assuring the Quality of Medical Information on the Internet. Caveat lector et viewer, let the reader and viewer beware. And this was 3 of us writing a how-to book in 1997 for how the medical internet ought to behave. And this is, I've written hundreds of papers and a dozen books or so, but this one article is more reference than anything else I ever wrote. It's still, people are using this as a fundamental reference as to how you put something together to publish on the internet. So it has stood what we call the test of time, at least since 1997. That's pretty good. It isn't 50 years, but it's more than 20. So there you go. And here's your last reference. It is Medscape this year, September 24, 2020. I wrote it. It's called Medscape and the History of Internet Medical Ethics. How we invented the medical internet, how we invented the ethics of the medical internet, where we drew from with references to the sources that guided us as we invented the medical internet. We said early on, it's got to have solid ethics, and here's how we're going to build the ethics. We went to 4 main sources and we built it, and this will tell you exactly how that happened with references as to why you can believe the medical internet if you do it right these days. I have 3 minutes to 2, and I will shut up and see if anybody else wants to say something.
Thank you so much, George. This was
My pleasure.
wonderful. Such um, a a thorough review of ethics from a practitioner's approach, and including so many of the core public health functions, especially dissemination, which you've been, as you pointed out, a global leader in for half a century. So thank you for that.
My pleasure.
We are up at the top of the hour, and so we should probably close here. If folks want to stay on for another 5 minutes, George, if that's okay.
That's just fine. I'm going to the swimming pool as soon as we get through here.
Okay.
I'm not kidding.
Thank you.
It's still warm
I'm
enough.
glad to know that. I will, we will do our follow-up though for everyone by email. So Hugo's going to send out the follow-up email that will give a description of what we are going to be doing over this next week. Please feel free to contact any of us offline through the the course site. I just want to close formally, and then if you have the time to stay on for another 5 minutes and you have questions for Dr. Lundberg, that's great. But I'm just going to initiate some applause for our guest lecturer. And
Thank you much. My email is gdlundberg@gmail.com. It's not hidden. It's available. I answer it. Sometimes I'm a little late, but I'm there. GD, that George David, and don't put glundberg@gmail.com, because that goes to a guy in Utah who I never met, but who gets a lot of my mail. So make sure gdlundberg@gmail.com. Anything you want to ask, that's fine.
all right. Well, I'm going to say goodbye to those of you who need to exit. Please, if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, be delighted to have direct interaction. Anyone has anything they want to pose for Dr. Lundberg?
I just wanted a real life example. What is the most difficult ethical decision you've had to face in your career? And what was your thought process on making the final decision?
I'm very sorry. My earphones are working pretty good, but I did not understand the question.
Oh, so,
She wanted to know your most difficult ethical decision.
My most difficult ethical, well, they happen all over the place. But I suppose the number one thing historically, one that pops to my mind immediately, was whether or not to publish It's Over Debbie. Go to Google and just enter It's Over Debbie, JAMA, and you'll come upon a description and a piece of my mind in JAMA of a doctor self-describing killing a patient who was in agony, and whether or not to publish that, which was purported to be true. And I had to do it by withholding the name of the doctor because he's confessing to murder under those circumstances. And this was in the late 1980s. And it was published after peer review and after a little bit of revision. I've never revealed the name of the doctor. I know who it was, but I never revealed it. And neither did that author. But to publish a person describing how they killed a patient and why they did it and why they thought it was the right thing to do. And I published it because it was the right thing to do to present. I didn't say it was right to kill a patient, but I said it's right to publish it so that people can really talk about pain, suffering versus dying in a terminal cancer patient and how far you go. This was before assisted suicide got anywhere in the United States conversation. And this one piece produced discussion, dialogue a lot about the issue of death and dying, pain relief, not worrying about addicting somebody when they're terminal, and relieve their pain, for goodness sake, don't let them suffer, etc. So that came to my mind immediately. It was a very good question, Candace. Thank you.
So I had another question.
Please.
My internet isn't stable.
If you want to put it into the chat.
I don't know if you can hear me, Dr. Philippe from the Bahamas.
Yes.
I'll put it in the chat, or can you hear me?
No, we can
I
hear
hear
you.
you.
Yes. Oh, but now you're muted. But we were able to hear you.
We can hear you.
Dr. Kelly, we were able to hear you, but now you're muted. George.
Oh, so can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. So, thank you so much. It's such a privilege to hear from a living legend. When I Googled your name, what came up was your service in JAMA and the incident in 1999. Again, as you spoke about the ethical implications of publishing information, you had published an article about, oral sex, and, it was not well received by the standard, the system at the time. Can you share, your conviction or principle in addressing that in terms of sometimes, you stand up for what is right, but the system isn't ready for that kind of integrity, I suppose.
Thank you very much for the question. Anybody who goes to Google and looks me up gets a lot of stuff, but that often comes up at the top. My firing by the AMA after 17 years of service on January 15, 1999, as a matter of fact. Were there ethical implications, the whole thing? Oh yeah, huge ethical implication, political implication, all kinds of stuff. In fact, the system was ready for that. And the membership of the American Medical Association was overwhelmingly in favor of my continuing as the editor of the JAMA. And the person who fired me was himself fired not long thereafter for a variety of other reasons, but that sort of led to it. In part, there were other reasons as well. But I won that one big time, even though I lost my job. 1 month later, I took the job as editor-in-chief of Medscape, and we built internet medicine for the next, from then on. So it was a blessing in disguise, you could say, in some ways. Although I loved my job, I was very good at it. I never would have invented or created the Medscape if I'd stayed at AMA. So it worked fine. The issue had to do, however, with publishing a paper that was not solicited by experts in the surveys designed from the Kinsey Institute at Indiana University, who had done a survey research of college students, asking them the basic question of, would you say you had sex if? And then the deal was if it was penile vaginal, penile oral, penile hand, hand whatever, or anything at all, penile anal. And the students, the vast majority of students said, well, I would say I wasn't having sex except for penile anal and penile vaginal. The rest, that's was sex. Everybody said. The rest of it, no, I wasn't having sex. So the public health question is, you're a doctor and a patient comes in and you think they have it may have a sexually transmitted disease. You've been having sex? No, I haven't had sex. What it meant at that time would have been having oral sex, and they said, no, I wasn't having sex. It wasn't. Now, the tricky part, the political part of that was that Bill Clinton had been impeached by the House of Representatives over the issue of whether he perjured himself under oath when he said, I didn't have sex with that Lewinsky woman. And that was on tape. And so he went to trial in the United States Senate. He was acquitted, but barely. One of those things, highly contentious. And this paper happened to get published after he was impeached, before he went on trial. So Republicans who hated Clinton, wanted him gone, basically told the Washington office of the AMA, the lobbying efforts, told the officers of the AMA, you have got to fire this man. You got to stop that from being published. To start with, they tried, they couldn't stop it. It was already in print. Then you've got to take his head off publicly. So they did. I was fired on live TV because the Republicans told the AMA office, we'll never talk to you again if you let that guy stay as the editor. So that's the way that all went down. My son was in Singapore that day. He had a CNN on. He said, what happened to you? I just saw you get fired on live TV. Anyway, that's the story. But the public health reason for publishing that, I've told you. Now, I was not blind to the fact that there were political implications, that I figured we'd probably get on the front page of the New York Times and lead the evening news on CBS, NBC, and ABC with this, and we did. And so it was a big hullabaloo, and ended up, because AMA fired me, breached my contract, had huge backlash from the membership. They had to pay me a whole lot of money to make me go away. And so that was nice. Then I went on to do all this other stuff. But that's what comes up. Is it ethics? Yeah. And the journal did better because of that, because it took a year to get a new editor. 2 of my deputies remained as co-editors. And in the process of that, the AMA set up a process that there would be a committee, an oversight committee, not of AMA ownership, between the ruling body of the AMA and the editor of the journal. That would prevent that from ever happening again, as long as the editor behaved ethically and competently. You have to be able to get rid of editors. They're good ones and they're bad ones, but not for ethical breaches. In that way, I mean, yeah, bad. So that was set up, and all the other journals, the big ones, have all followed that line to protect the editors and editorial freedom. You all know that freedom is never free. You have to fight for it. Independence is never free. You have to fight for that. Erica, that's
Sure.
more than 5.
Yeah, thank you. I think that maybe we will stop there. This was actually the story that I had asked George first when we talked about this webinar for him to talk about, because ever since I was a medical student, George told me, I know that the way that I'm going to leave JAMA is being fired. And it was such an example of consistent integrity that really prompted my wanting George to come and tell you about his lifetime of standing up for public health ethics principles and for doing so with integrity. So again, I want to thank you, Dr. Lundberg, for being with us today, and thank everyone for joining us. And
Thank you all very much and have a great course. I'm going.
thank you. Okay. Bye, everyone. Thank you. See you next week.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.